University Commission recommended the creation of civic agreements, strategic long-term collaborative commitments between universities and their partners. Can you describe Keele's approach and why you've chosen the approach that you have to your civic agreement?
So our civic agreements obviously are a series of different areas around the so-called Keele deals. And the first of those, I think, went back probably 4 to 5 years ago now, which was focused on the economy. And I think the important thing was actually it did emerge out of conversations with largely the local public sector, so the local authorities, where the concept of deals actually is part of their vocabulary, which I think helps. Although they do tend to think of deals as sort of a definitive amount of money exchanging hands, whereas what we wanted was a common view of some important things that needed doing. And I think it's important to say they weren't designed to be comprehensive. They were designed effectively to create a number of focused opportunities or projects that actually everybody around the table could sign up for, to give us some things to focus on. And I haven't really thought about them in this way before, but I think that's what it is. They're not trying to give the whole picture. They are trying to effectively lay out some of the things that the local communities, the local organisations, the local authorities can expect from the university, and in return effectively give warning that we will be knocking on doors for people to work with us on specific projects as they come along. So I think that's the broad framework, and obviously we've gone through from the economic one through to a whole series of others, with the latest one being focused around the recovery agenda. A university with a civic responsibility, I think, is how we phrase it, rather than a civic university. And I think that really does go right back to the formation of Keele in 1949 as a university that was specifically put in this part of the world to fulfill that function, recognising that there was a gap in higher education in this part of the world, which was obviously coming out of the war with specific challenges. And we've talked a lot about maintaining that original value and that original aim of Keele, where it was around education in the main to start with. There was talk around it being more of a technical approach, but that never really appeared in the university portfolio in any significant way. So we do talk about having a civic duty, but we don't necessarily use that civic university concept very much. This part of the world was a little bit behind some others in thinking about the local implementation of the industrial strategy. So that conversation has been happening over the last few months, and it effectively has morphed into that. How do we get through COVID, and then what is the plan for coming out? And it's actually given an interesting focus to a conversation that I think was struggling to get going before the pandemic. I think this part of the world didn't quite know what its response to the industrial strategy should be, but it's allowed us to focus on a series of areas. I'm chairing a subgroup for the LEC, for example, on innovation, which this part of the world hasn't had before. I know Liz Barnes at Staffordshire is chairing one around skills and workforce development. So I think supporting some of the local public sector organisations in that sort of way has been critical, and hopefully will then provide some of that long-term planning and long-term opportunities for not just the community, but some of the businesses more broadly in this part of the world. How UKRI responds to the levelling up agenda or the regional aspects of the R&D roadmap and things, I think it's going to be fascinating, and I think that can cut across a lot of the things, the approaches that organisations such as the research councils have taken in the past, which has effectively been geographically blind to where they would fund. But that's not an easy thing for them to address, and it's going to be interesting to see what experiments we get in terms of how they might build up some of that local civic impact or regional impact into their evaluation of the value of potential projects. So I don't think I'd like to sit down with a blank piece of paper and design an answer to that, but I think there will inevitably have to be some questions, some conversations, and probably, as I say, some experiments as to how that might be done. Part of the conversation, I think, that is starting to come through is actually whether levelling up automatically means direct investment in that part of the country that you're trying to level up, or whether actually it's around more of a ensuring a halo effect from some of those areas that don't need the levelling up, because absolutely what the country can't afford is for this to be levelling down. And we know that resources are going to be scarce. So again, a really important set of challenges in there. And certainly I see one of the issues for Stoke and Staffordshire is sort of being trying to make sure that we're receptive to those sorts of things, that we have I suppose it's a sort of absorptive capacity, that we can respond, that we can partner, not just within our part of the world, but sort of more broadly. And of course, again, an important role for universities in that, because we are going to be as well networked, if not better networked, both nationally and internationally, than many or most of the organisations that we are surrounded by. Therefore, it creates a slightly different angle for us in terms of being a conduit for those discussions of collaborations, whether it be into the public or the private sector, or in other parts of education for that matter. I think for me, I mean, we've got a broad research base. Some of it is very, very strong. Some of it is still very academically driven rather than that outward facing, whereas we've got some, and we talk a lot about our sustainability agenda and the fact that we've turned our campus into a smart energy network demonstrator, where there's a lot of talk of hydrogen at the moment in the press, and we've spent the last year working with the private sector to demonstrate that you can put 20% of the gas supply turned over to being hydrogen rather than carbon-based gas, which would in itself reduce the carbon footprint. And a very good example of, because we have our campus environment formulated as it specifically is, that experiment could be done here in a way that we believe is probably unique in Europe. And so there are some areas like that where we are already have the looking outwards, as well as having the strong underpinning research base to go with that. We've got some areas on the health side, in particular around general practice and community medicine, for example, that I would classify in the same sort of way, where literally if we got a phone call tomorrow, then we could activate things very, very quickly. In other areas, we have that strength. We might not have the sort of scale of activity on the research, or we might not have quite made that step from the core research base into that more outward facing. And clearly that is something that we're all trying to encourage a lot of universities to do. And at the basis of things like the KE concordat, really, to just try and give people like me as a Vice Chancellor a nudge to say, we should be thinking about that all of the time, in terms of making sure that we have things in place to capitalise on the expertise and the outputs that we produce in every university on a daily and weekly basis. Don't think I dare give advice in one respect, because I think we're still working it out here. I mean, I think we are trying to make it as bottom up as possible in terms of actually a lot of the concordat is around supporting our staff and students to engage, and so we've got to engage with staff and students to make sure that we know what they're currently thinking and what they feel they might need in order to develop that. Likewise with external partners. So I think that's where a lot of that is coming from, but also using it just to get on the general agenda. We are talking to heads of schools about it. We will be talking specifically to Senate about it. And in the past, what have they had? Well, they've probably had reports from me when we've got something to shout about because something's gone well. They probably had fairly dry numerical reports that say we've had this much ERDF funding in the last year and everything else. And I think we're still obviously in the early stages, but what I'm hoping is that in preparing for the action planning and the sort of self-evaluation, that actually it brings the whole area a bit more alive to a larger set of people around the university. And I guess at a national level, I shouldn't be low in my ambition at a national level, but if that's all it does in every university in the country, then it'll have done some good.
Yeah,
and so I think, and that's where we've got to start. And I think that's what I would, in terms of advice, I'd give advice as to how to do it, but I think the advice of trying to make it seem less like a bureaucratic process and really a developmental process.